The guards didn't need to drag her. On the morning of May 30th, 1431, in the old market square of Rouen, France, 19-year-old Joan of Arc walked to the stake on her own feet. They'd dressed her in a long white gown, placed a paper mitre on her head with the words, "Heretic relapsed, apostate, idolater," scrawled across it. But her legs didn't buckle. Thousands had gathered to watch the teenage girl burn. Some came for entertainment. Others came because they'd been ordered. But as the executioner, Geoffroy Tirage, later testified in the rehabilitation trial, something happened in those final moments that he could never explain, something that haunted him until his death. Joan's lips were moving. The crowd strained to hear, expecting curses, pleas for mercy, or the screams that always came. But what escaped her mouth was something else entirely, something so unexpected that even the English soldiers who'd captured her, the bishops who'd condemned her, and the executioner who bound her to the post would spend the rest of their lives trying to forget what they heard. But here's what they didn't tell you in history class. Joan of Arc wasn't supposed to be at that stake at all. Just 4 days earlier, on May 24th, she'd done exactly what the court wanted. After months of relentless interrogation, after being threatened with torture, after being shown the instruments that would tear her flesh, after being locked in chains in a cell where English soldiers mocked and threatened her, she'd signed a document of abjuration. She'd recanted everything. Her visions, her voices, her divine mission to save France. The court had won. They'd gotten their confession. Joan would live out her days in a church prison, wearing women's clothing as required by the terms of her surrender. The story should have ended there, with a broken teenage girl disappearing into ecclesiastical custody, her legend crushed before it could fully form. The English got what they wanted, proof that France's savior was nothing more than a deluded heretic who'd admitted her crimes. Charles VII, the king Joan had crowned, breathed easier knowing this embarrassing chapter was closed. Then something happened that changed everything. On the night of May 27th, or the morning of May 28th, accounts vary, the guards entered Joan's cell and found her wearing men's clothing again. It was the one thing she'd explicitly promised not to do, the one condition of her survival. Different witnesses gave different explanations for what happened. Some said the guards had taken her women's clothing and left only the male outfit. Others suggested she'd been threatened or attacked and put on the men's clothing to protect herself from assault. Joan herself later testified that she'd heard her voices again, St. Catherine and St. Margaret, telling her she'd committed a terrible sin by recanting, that God had sent them to tell her of the great pity of her betrayal. But none of these explanations answer the real question. This wasn't a naive farm girl making a mistake. Joan knew exactly what wearing those clothes meant. She'd lived through the trial. She understood the game being played. The moment she put on those breeches and tunic, she was choosing the fire. The rehabilitation trial 25 years later tried to untangle this mystery. Witness after witness testified about those final days, painting a picture that historians still debate. Brother Martin Ladvenu, the Dominican friar who heard her final confession, described a young woman who'd found a clarity that terrified everyone around her. Brother Isambart de la Pierre, another friar present during the trial, testified that Joan had told him she'd rather die than continue living with the knowledge that she'd denied the voices that had guided her since she was 13 years old. These weren't the words of someone who'd given up. They were the words of someone who'd made a calculation, weighed her immortal soul against a few more years of imprisonment, and chosen what she believed was eternal life over temporary survival. The court reconvened. Bishop Pierre Cochon, who'd orchestrated the entire trial, could barely contain his satisfaction. Joan had relapsed. Under church law, this meant only one thing. There would be no second chance. No more negotiations. The sentence was death by burning. But wait, because here's the part that makes this story truly devastating. Joan wasn't being executed for military crimes. She wasn't being punished for fighting against England. The charge was heresy, specifically the claim that she'd received visions and voices directly from God without the mediation of the Church. Think about what this meant. The Catholic Church in 1431 had a very specific hierarchy of spiritual authority. God spoke to the Pope spoke to the cardinals and bishops, the bishops spoke to the priests spoke to the common people. A 19-year-old illiterate farm girl claiming that God spoke directly to her, telling her to crown a king and lead armies, was a threat to the entire system. It didn't matter that her voices had been correct about everything they'd predicted. It didn't matter that she'd accomplished military victories that seasoned commanders said were impossible. It didn't matter that she'd done exactly what she said she would do: relieve the siege of Orléans, take Charles VII to Reims for his coronation, and turn the tide of the 100 Years' War. None of that mattered, because she'd bypassed the system. She'd claimed direct access to God, and that was unforgivable. The execution was scheduled for the morning, but they started building the pyre the night before. Geoffroy Terrage, the executioner, later testified that he'd been given specific instructions. The platform had to be built unusually high, higher than normal burnings, so the crowd could see clearly, and so Terrage himself couldn't show any mercy by strangling Joan before the flames reached her, a common practice to spare victims the worst of the agony. They wanted her to burn fully conscious. They wanted her to burn slowly. They wanted everyone to see that this is what happened to people who claimed God spoke to them directly. On the morning of May 30th, Joan was taken from her cell and brought to the old market square. She asked to hold a cross. An English soldier broke 2 pieces of wood from a nearby fence and tied them together, handing it to her. She clutched it against her chest. She asked for a proper crucifix from the church, and Brother Martin Ladvenu ran to fetch one. As they bound her to the stake, Joan asked that the crucifix be held high enough that she could see it through the flames. The sources from that day, from witnesses who were actually there, describe something that doesn't fit our modern image of martyrdom. Joan wasn't stoic. She wasn't silently brave. She was terrified. She wept. She called out to her saints. She cried for her mother and father back in Domremy, the village she'd left 6 years earlier when the voices first told her she had a mission. Multiple witnesses testified that she sobbed. This is important because it destroys the myth of the fearless martyr who went to her death with superhuman courage. Joan was fully, completely human in those final moments. She was 19 years old, and she was about to be burned alive, and she knew it, and she was scared. But here's what changed everything: the moment that would echo through centuries. As the flames began to rise, as the smoke started to curl upward, Joan's voice rang out across the square. She wasn't screaming yet, though that would come soon enough. She was praying, but not the formal Latin prayers of the church that had condemned her. She was praying in French, in her own words, in a voice loud enough that the front rows of the crowd could hear clearly. The witnesses who testified later didn't all agree on the exact words, memory being what it is, especially when recording something so traumatic, but they agreed on the substance. Joan was praying directly to God, to Jesus Christ, to her saints. She was asking them not to save her from the fire. That's the crucial detail everyone misses. She wasn't begging for a miracle, for the flames to part, for an angel to descend and break her chains. She was asking for something else entirely. She was asking for the strength to endure what was coming. She was asking that her faith not break as her body broke. She was asking that she hold on to her truth through the agony, that she not recant again even when the pain became unbearable. Brother Martin Ladvenu testified that Joan cried out repeatedly to St. Michael, St. Catherine, and St. Margaret. These were the 3 saints who'd appeared to her since childhood, the voices that had guided her entire mission. She called to them by name. She spoke to them as if they were standing right there beside the pyre, as if she could see them through the smoke and flames. She told them she'd been right to trust them, that she'd been wrong to deny them 4 days earlier, that she was sorry for her weakness, that she was ready now. Multiple witnesses described how her voice remained clear and strong, even as the flames reached her feet, even as the smell of burning flesh began to fill the square. She kept praying. She kept calling out to her saints. And then as the fire climbed higher, she began repeating one word over and over again: Jesus. Not in Latin, in French. Jesus. Again and again and again. Here's what the executioner, Geoffroy Terrage, testified at the rehabilitation trial, and this is documented, not legend. I greatly fear that I am damned, for I have burned a saint. He said this to the examining magistrates 25 years later. still haunted, still unable to forget. He described how even as Joan's body burned, even as the flames consumed her, she kept crying out that name. Jesus. The crowd heard it. The soldiers heard it. The bishops who'd condemned her heard it. An English soldier who'd sworn he'd throw a bundle of wood onto the fire himself later testified that he'd seen a white dove fly out of the flames at the moment of Joan's death. The same soldier, identified in the records as John Tressard, secretary to the King of England, was heard saying as he left the square, "We are lost. We have burned a saint." Another English soldier testified that he'd been one of the mockers, one of the men who'd jeered and celebrated, but that he'd needed to go to a tavern afterward to drink because he couldn't stop shaking. But here's the detail that breaks through the centuries and lands like a physical blow. Joan's heart wouldn't burn. The executioner testified to this specifically. After the body was consumed, after the flames had done their work, he was ordered to rake through the ashes and scatter them in the Seine River so no relics could be collected, no shrine could be built. But when he raked through the remains, Joan's heart was still intact. He added more fuel. He built up the fire hotter. The heart still wouldn't burn. He tried a third time. Same result. Finally, he gave up and threw everything, ashes and the heart together, into the river. This detail appears in multiple testimonies from multiple witnesses who had no reason to coordinate their stories decades later. The executioner himself confirmed it. The man whose job was to burn people to death who'd done this countless times before said he'd never seen anything like it. Now we need to talk about what that prayer actually meant, what Joan was really asking for in those final moments, because this is where history and spirituality collide in a way that makes people uncomfortable. Joan of Arc believed, completely and without reservation, that God had spoken directly to her, not metaphorically, not through scripture or through the teaching of priests. Directly. She'd heard voices giving her specific military instructions. She'd seen visions showing her the future, and every single thing the voices told her came true, right up until her capture. She'd been told she'd relieve Orleans. She did. She'd been told she'd crown the king at Rheims. She did. She'd been told she'd be wounded by an arrow above her breast at Orleans. She was, exactly as predicted. These weren't vague prophecies that could be interpreted multiple ways. These were specific, verifiable predictions that a teenage farm girl with no military training somehow fulfilled. So when Joan prayed at the stake, when she called out to her saints, she wasn't praying to abstract concepts. She was talking to beings she believed she knew personally, beings who'd been her companions and guides for 6 years. The rehabilitation trial collected testimony from people who'd known Joan throughout her life. Her childhood friends from Domremy described how she'd always been unusually pious, how she'd spent hours in church, how she'd cry during Mass. But they also described a normal girl who laughed and played and worked in the fields. The voices started when she was about 13, in her father's garden on a summer day. She described seeing a bright light and hearing a voice she later identified as Saint Michael. The voice told her she had to be good, had to go to church, had to prepare herself because God had a mission for her. At first, she was terrified. She didn't tell anyone, but the voices came back, again and again, becoming more specific. They told her about the dire situation of France, about the English occupation, about the siege of Orleans. They told her she was chosen to save France. Think about what this meant for a teenage girl in 15th century France. Joan couldn't read or write. She'd never left her village. She'd certainly never seen a battlefield or held a sword. Her father was a farmer, relatively prosperous but firmly working class. Girls in her position had one future: marriage, children, managing a household. But the voices told her something impossible. They told her to cut her hair, dress in men's clothing, travel across enemy territory to meet the Dauphin Charles, convince him to give her an army, and then lead that army to relieve Orleans and take Charles to Reims for his coronation. It was insane. It was blasphemous. It was absolutely impossible. And she did it anyway. She did every single part of it. When her father found out she wanted to meet with the Dauphin, he swore he'd drown her himself rather than see her bring such shame on the family. She went anyway. When she first approached the royal court, they laughed at her. A farm girl claiming God sent her to save France? They tested her, tried to trick her, had the Dauphin hide among the courtiers to see if she could identify him. She walked straight to him without hesitation. The military commanders were furious when Charles actually gave this teenage girl troops to command. But she'd told Charles secrets about his prayers, things no one else could have known, and he believed her. At Orléans, seasoned soldiers who'd fought for decades watched in disbelief as Joan's tactics worked. She didn't have military training, but her voices gave her specific instructions about where to attack, when to attack, how to position forces, and it worked. Every time. The English, who'd been winning the 100 Years' War for generations, suddenly couldn't win a battle. French soldiers who'd been demoralized, who'd been losing for so long they'd forgotten what victory felt like, rallied around this teenage girl carrying a banner with Jesus Maria written on it. She didn't even carry a sword into battle most of the time. She carried her banner. She told the soldiers that if they had courage, if they fought for God and France, they couldn't lose, and they didn't. The siege of Orléans, which military historians said was unbreakable, was broken in 9 days after Joan arrived. So when Joan prayed at the stake, when she called out to Saints Michael, Catherine, and Margaret, she was calling to beings who'd never lied to her, who'd predicted everything accurately, who'd guided her to impossible victories. But here's the devastating part, the part that makes her final prayer so heartbreaking. The voices had also told her she'd be captured. They'd warned her. She'd even told people at court that she wouldn't last more than a year. But the voices never told her she'd be rescued. They never promised her earthly salvation. They promised her something else entirely. They told her that if she stayed true to them, if she didn't deny them even under torture and threat of death, she'd be saved eternally. That's what she was praying for at the stake, not for the flames to go out, not for a rescue. She was praying for the strength to keep her faith intact while her body was destroyed, because she believed her immortal soul was worth more than a few more years of life. The trial record reveals something most people don't know. Joan was offered multiple chances to save herself. If she'd agreed to wear women's clothing permanently, if she'd admitted her voices were delusions or demons, if she'd accepted the authority of the church to interpret her experiences for her, she could have lived. They offered her life imprisonment instead of death. They offered her church custody instead of English chains. But every offer required the same thing: admitting her voices weren't real, weren't from God, weren't worth trusting. And this she couldn't do, because in her mind, that would be calling God a liar. Better to burn than to commit that sin. When she recanted on May 24th, when she signed the abjuration, she'd betrayed her voices to save her life. The sources describe her deep distress afterward. Brother Isambard de la Pierre testified that she wept inconsolably, saying she'd damned herself. When the voices came back and told her she'd done wrong, that she needed to retract her abjuration even if it meant death, she didn't hesitate. She put on the men's clothing again. She told the judges she'd lied in her confession, that her voices were real, that she'd rather die than deny them again. This is what makes her final prayer so powerful, so devastating, so impossible to forget even 600 years later. Joan wasn't praying to avoid suffering. She was praying to suffer well, to suffer faithfully, to let the pain purify rather than break her. When witnesses described her crying out "Jesus" repeatedly as the flames rose, they weren't describing mindless screaming. They described how each repetition sounded like an affirmation, like she was reminding herself who she was dying for, why this mattered, what waited on the other side. Jean Massieu, another of the priests present, testified that Joan's voice remained clear and that she specifically cried out that her voices had not deceived her, that everything her voices had told her came from God. She said this while burning alive. She used her last breaths not to curse her executioners, not to beg for mercy, but to testify one final time that the voices she'd heard since she was 13 years old were real, were divine, and were worth dying for. The immediate aftermath of the execution reveals just how deeply Joan's death affected everyone who witnessed it. The English soldiers, who should have been celebrating the destruction of France's greatest military asset, were shaken. Multiple sources describe a grim, subdued mood among the occupying forces. The soldier who claimed he saw a dove fly from the flames started drinking heavily, couldn't stop talking about what he'd seen. The executioner, as mentioned, believed he'd damned himself by killing a saint. But the most telling reaction came from the judges and church officials who'd condemned her. They scattered quickly after the execution. Pierre Cochon, the bishop who'd orchestrated the trial, spent the rest of his life defending his actions, writing lengthy justifications, trying to convince people that the trial had been fair and just. He died in 1442, collapsing while being shaved by a barber, struck down suddenly at age 70. The rehabilitation trial would later declare his entire proceeding fraudulent, a political show trial designed to discredit Charles VII by destroying the girl who'd crowned him. 25 years after Joan burned, after the English had been driven from France, after Charles VII secured his throne permanently, the king ordered a rehabilitation trial. This wasn't primarily about Joan. It was about Charles himself. If Joan had been a heretic and witch as the English trial claimed, then Charles was a king crowned by the guidance of a heretic and witch. His legitimacy was tainted, so the rehabilitation trial served to restore both Joan's honor and Charles's legitimacy. But something unexpected happened during that trial. The church officials examining the case didn't just find procedural errors in the original trial. They found something that shocked them. They found that the teenage farm girl might actually have been telling the truth. Witness after witness, including many who'd been skeptical or hostile during the original trial, testified to Joan's piety, her military genius, her prophecies that came true. They described a young woman of extraordinary character, faith, and courage. The rehabilitation trial concluded in 1456 that the original trial had been corrupted, that the verdict was invalid, and that Joan had died a martyr, faithful to the church and to God. But here's what that rehabilitation trial couldn't answer, what historians still debate, what makes Joan of Arc such a fascinating and controversial figure. Were the voices real? Did God actually speak to a teenage farm girl, giving her specific military instructions that turned the tide of a century-long war? Or was Joan a brilliant strategic thinker who suffered from auditory hallucinations but managed to use them productively, channeling her visions into military victory? Or was she a masterful opportunist who claimed divine guidance because it was the only way a woman in 15th century France could gain military authority? Modern scholars have proposed psychological explanations: temporal lobe epilepsy, schizophrenia, religious ecstasy. But none of these explanations account for the accuracy of her military predictions, the consistency of her testimony under years of hostile interrogation, or the fact that uneducated farm girls in 1420s France didn't typically develop sophisticated military strategies that professional soldiers couldn't counter. What we know for certain is what Joan believed and what she was willing to die for. The prayer she whispered, the words she cried out as the flames rose, revealed a young woman who'd calculated the cost of her faith and decided it was worth paying. She'd seen what denial cost her. 4 days of living with the knowledge that she'd betrayed her voices, that she'd called her life's work a delusion, that she'd chosen survival over truth. She couldn't do it. When she put on those men's clothes again, when she retracted her abjuration, she was choosing the fire over the lie. Her final prayer wasn't asking God to change her circumstances. It was asking God to change her, to make her strong enough to endure the consequences of refusing to deny him. Every time she cried out, "Jesus," she was affirming that her suffering had meaning, that her death was not defeat but victory, that the flames consuming her body were releasing her soul to the paradise her voices had promised. The Catholic Church eventually canonized Joan of Arc as a saint in 1920, nearly 500 years after her death. She became the patron saint of France, of soldiers, of prisoners. But long before the official canonization, people were praying to her, asking her for the same thing she'd asked for at the stake: the courage to hold on to truth even when it costs everything. Her story resonated because it confronted the central human fear, not the fear of death itself, but the fear that our suffering will be meaningless, that we'll break under pressure, that we'll betray what matters most to us when the stakes get high enough. Joan showed that a 19-year-old girl could face the worst death imaginable while holding on to her truth, while affirming her faith, while refusing to deny what she knew to be real. That's why her prayer matters. That's why it echoes across 6 centuries, not because she was superhuman, but because she was completely, frailly human, terrified and weeping and calling out for help, and yet somehow she didn't break.